Write as many facts as you can. June 6th, 1944, 5 a.m. Crisbecq Battery, Normandy coast. Through the cold pre-dawn mist, the lenses of Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen's Zeiss binoculars trembled slightly in his hands. From his concrete observation post atop the Crisbecq Battery, he swept the horizon and saw something that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. What lay before him defied every assurance the German High Command had given. The English Channel, once the Reich's trusted moat of protection, had transformed overnight into a vast metallic plain. From horizon to horizon stretched a dark, shifting mass of ships. Destroyers, battleships, transports, landing craft, their silhouettes merged into an unbroken armada, an endless procession of steel advancing toward the coast of Normandy. The figures, later confirmed by Allied records, were staggering. The invasion force numbered 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary ships, and 864 merchant vessels. Over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations manned this armada. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in human history, and it was heading straight for him. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from his 210mm checkmate Skoda guns roared into the dawn sky. Arching toward the oncoming fleet, a handful of droplets flung against a rising tsunami. The Crisbecq guns quickly found themselves dueling with American warships, the cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. Against such titans, the German battery's efforts were little more than symbolic defiance. Yet at 6:30 a.m., one of Ohmsen's shells struck true, detonating aboard the destroyer USS Corrie, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. For a brief, flickering moment, the guns of Crisbecq drew blood from the vast invasion fleet. But even then, Ohmsen understood the scale of what he was witnessing. What filled his rangefinder that morning was not merely an enemy fleet, it was the visible form of Allied industrial power, something that Nazi propaganda had long denied could exist. Each ship on the horizon represented a factory, a workforce, a continent's worth of industry set into motion. The mathematics of defeat were sailing toward him at 8 knots. And as the thunder of naval guns echoed across Normandy's coast, the transformation began, the beginning of the end for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. The night before, signals in the dark. The darkness of June 5th, 1944, brought with it a sense of unease across occupied France. The winds had shifted, the tides were high, and reports from coastal radar stations flickered with unexplained echoes. Yet at Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, 50 miles inland, most officers dismissed them as atmospheric interference. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April, was not among them. A career officer of sharp intellect and cautious temperament, Speidel monitored a growing stream of disturbing reports deep into the night. Paratroopers sighted near Carentan, explosions inland, disrupted telephone lines. Still, there was hesitation. Rommel himself was not even in France. The famed Desert Fox, convinced that poor weather made any invasion impossible, had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. His absence at such a pivotal hour would become one of history's cruel ironies. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army received confirmation. Massive parachute landings were underway across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the U.S. Army, over 13,000 men, were descending from Douglas C-47 Skytrains into the darkness behind German lines. In St. Lo, General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, grasped the situation instantly. A veteran of the Eastern Front, He had lost a leg at Stalingrad and learned to recognize the signs of catastrophe. Yet even he could not fathom the scale of what was coming. The German defenders had prepared for an invasion. Minefields, bunkers, and beach obstacles covered the coast. But they had not prepared for an industrial avalanche, a storm of men and machines beyond imagination. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Rommel's naval advisor since November 1943, had warned of this. Born into a seafaring family in 1894, Ruge understood naval warfare better than any German officer in France. He had pleaded for more mines, more coastal guns, more obstacles, but with little success. "We were preparing," he would later write in his memoir Rommel in Normandy, "to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one." German intelligence, guided by its own assumptions, had convinced itself that the Allies could muster perhaps 20 divisions and 3,000 ships at most. They based their calculations on German limitations, not Allied potential. 5 years of war had blinded them to the industrial scale of their enemy's mobilization. So when the first light of June 6 crept across the Normandy coast, reports arriving from observation posts between Cherbourg and Le Havre seemed impossible. Radar screens lit up with echoes too numerous to count. What officers saw through binoculars and rangefinders defied reason. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. This was no diversion, no feint. It was the greatest amphibious assault in human history. At strong point WN 62, overlooking what would become known as Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh peered from his machine gun embrasure. A farm boy from Mecklenburg, he had never seen the ocean before arriving in Normandy. Now, staring out to sea, he saw no ocean at all, only a solid wall of steel. Ships everywhere, he would later recall. Big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. I tried to count them but gave up at 100. There were thousands. Across 50 miles of invasion front, German soldiers and officers came to the same shattering realization. They were not facing superior numbers, they were facing an entirely different order of magnitude. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began, the storm from the sea. At 5:30 a.m., the horizon erupted. The Allied fleet, 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors opened fire in unison. The roar of thousands of naval guns merged into a single rolling thunder that shook the earth beneath Normandy's defenses. For the German defenders crouched in their bunkers, this was their first lesson in American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns during the first hour. Each shell weighed nearly 1,400 pounds. In just 60 minutes, one battleship unleashed 178 tons of high explosives, more ammunition than many German artillery regiments possessed in their entire stockpile. Before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches, the naval forces had already fired an estimated 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships, over 130,000 tons of ordnance in total. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West, later summarized it simply. "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." As the bombardment rolled inland, the second wave of the Allied assault appeared in the skies. At 6 a.m., the gray dawn was torn apart by the roar of engines. The air filled not with dozens or hundreds of aircraft, but thousands. Over 14,000 sorties were flown that day in direct support of the landings. Allied aircraft dominated every altitude, from lumbering bombers to nimble fighter bombers circling like hawks above the beaches. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, could muster barely 300 operational aircraft across all of France. On D-Day, it managed 319 sorties in total. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. The disparity was not merely numerical, it was absurd. Major Joseph Priller, commanding Jagerschwader 26, led the only recorded Luftwaffe attack on the beaches that morning. With just his wingman, Heinz Severloh, he made a brief strafing run over Sword Beach, then fled from overwhelming Allied fighter cover. The episode, often dramatized in post-war accounts, captured the reality of Germany's impotence in the air. Meanwhile, along the Normandy coastline, German gunners clung to their posts as shells rained down around them. The 352nd Infantry Division, manning strong points above Omaha Beach, was among the best-prepared units in the region. Their machine gun nests and casemates created interlocking fields of fire. When the first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions landed at 6:30 a.m., they stepped directly into a storm of bullets. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore through the assaulting ranks. Within minutes, the beach was littered with bodies. The sea turned crimson with blood. Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh, manning his MG-42 at Widerstands Nest 62, fired more than 12,000 rounds that morning. They came and kept coming, he later wrote. For every man we killed, another appeared. The sea itself seemed to give birth to them. For a few brief hours, it seemed possible that the Atlantic Wall might hold. The Americans were pinned down, their landing craft burning, their officers dead or wounded. General Omar Bradley, watching from his command ship offshore, even considered evacuation. Then, at around 8 a.m., something extraordinary happened. By 8 a.m., Omaha Beach was a scene of carnage and chaos. Burning landing craft drifted in the surf. Men huddled behind steel obstacles, or the bodies of their comrades, pinned down by relentless machine gun fire from the bluffs above. Radio communications were failing, and landing waves were piling up behind each other, creating traffic jams of men and steel under fire. Aboard his flagship, General Omar Bradley watched the slaughter unfold through binoculars and weighed the unthinkable withdrawal. The first waves had been shattered. Entire companies had ceased to exist. But then, amid the smoke and confusion, a decision was made that would change the course of the battle. Several American destroyer captains, acting on their own initiative, turned their ships toward the shore. Ignoring the risk of running aground or hitting mines, the USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt advanced until they were within 1,000 yards of the beach point-blank range for naval guns. Their hulls trembled in the shallow water as they opened fire directly on the German strongpoints, each shell smashing into concrete bunkers that had resisted everything else. From their bunkers, German defenders watched in disbelief. The ships were so close that gunners could see the muzzle flashes from their 5-inch guns and feel the concussions of the impacts. At such range, the destroyers could not miss. One after another, the firing positions that had pinned the Americans down were obliterated. Widerstands Nest 62, WN 61, and WN 64, the key German positions overlooking Omaha, fell silent under the storm of naval fire. This moment marked the psychological turning point of D-Day. The USS Corey, sunk earlier that morning by Ohmsen's battery, was already replaced by new ships moving in without hesitation. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. The Kriegsmarine could not afford to lose even a single destroyer. Every ship represented months of work and scarce materials. To the Americans, a ship was simply a tool, one among thousands. For the first time, German officers began to grasp the true nature of what they were facing. It was not simply bravery or tactics, but industrial willpower, the confidence born from knowing that losses could be replaced, that production would outpace destruction. As the destroyers' guns roared, fresh waves of landing craft approached the beaches. The stream seemed endless. From his command post, Oberleutnant Ohmsen saw landing craft of every type: LCTs, landing craft, tank, unloading 30-ton Sherman tanks, LSTs, landing ship, beaching themselves and opening vast steel doors to disgorge vehicles. DUKW amphibious trucks swimming ashore with supplies. It was a living machine, a conveyor belt of war that seemed to draw directly from the sea itself. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops. 132,000. 715 by sea, 23,000. 400 by air. They had established 5 beachheads across a 50-mile front. The German 7th Army, responsible for defending all of Normandy, had fewer men in total. In just the first 24 hours, Allied forces put ashore 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. Germany had spent 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to stop such an invasion. In one day, the Allies had overwhelmed it through sheer volume. As the fires burned along the coast and the beaches filled with wounded and wreckage, the men in German command posts began to understand the scale of what was unfolding. They had not merely been attacked, they had been outproduced. The counterattack that failed. At dawn on June 7th, the second day of the invasion, German commanders across northern France still clung to a single hope: that the panzers might yet drive the Allies back into the sea. The idea had been central to Hitler's defensive strategy. The Atlantic Wall, he insisted, would hold the enemy long enough for armored reserves to deliver the killing blow. But as the hours passed, that theory collapsed under the weight of reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, having rushed back from Germany, arrived at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon late in the morning. The scene that greeted him was chaos, conflicting reports, jammed telephone lines, and a command structure frozen by Hitler's indecision. Under the Führer Directive No. 51, issued in November 1943, no panzer division could move without Hitler's personal authorization. The result was paralysis. When the landings began, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Panzerlehr, and 21st Panzer Division were all positioned within striking distance of Normandy. Yet their movements were delayed for crucial hours, first by confusion, then by the Allied air forces that ruled the skies. At 10 a.m., the 12th SS received orders to advance toward Caen. But before its leading elements could reach the front, Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, P-47 Thunderbolts, and Mustangs struck with devastating precision. Each road, bridge, and convoy became a death trap. Columns of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks crawled forward only to be ambushed from above. The air was filled with the shriek of rockets and the hiss of burning fuel. By evening, the division had lost dozens of vehicles before even making contact with the enemy. The vaunted German armored counterattack had been destroyed not by combat, but by logistics and air denial. General Hans Speidel, watching from headquarters, understood immediately what this meant. The enemy, he later wrote, had achieved more than air superiority. He had achieved air monopoly. In previous wars, the battlefield had been defined by space lines, fronts, and fortifications. Now it was defined by control of the vertical dimension. Whoever owned the sky could dictate movement, supply, and survival. Rommel, ever the realist, grasped the truth faster than most. He toured the front personally, his car weaving through burning wreckage and strafed roads. At one stop near Saint-Lô, he stood beside the smoking hull of a Panzer IV and said quietly to his adjutant, "The war is lost. Even our bravest soldiers cannot fight steel and machines that never stop coming." Indeed, the machines never stopped. From the moment the first Allied soldier landed, a massive logistical apparatus began to unfold behind him, an operation that dwarfed anything in human history. Mulberry harbors, artificial ports built from prefabricated concrete caissons, were towed across the channel and assembled off the beaches like gigantic puzzles. Within days, they allowed the unloading of 9,000 tons of supplies per day, increasing to 18,000 by the end of June. By contrast, German supply routes depended on narrow country roads, already wrecked by bombers and partisans. Fuel shortages crippled every movement. Communications were unreliable, and reinforcements from the east arrived too late or not at all. The Kriegsmarine, powerless to intervene, could only watch from a distance. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, was now a ghost of itself, unable to challenge the constant roar of Allied aircraft. The German counteroffensive never truly began. It dissolved before it could form, crushed by air power, logistics, and the sheer tempo of an enemy that fought on an industrial clock. By June 10th, Rommel's worst fears had come true. The Allies had landed over 325,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. The bridgehead was secure. For the men of the Wehrmacht, it was the end of one world and the beginning of another, a war no longer defined by courage or strategy alone, but by the mass production of force itself. Aftermath: the meaning of overlord. By mid-July 1944, the green fields of Normandy had become a wasteland of ash and iron. Entire villages, Saint-Lô, Caen, Tilly, Sur-Sulz, were reduced to rubble by Allied artillery and bombing. The hedgerows that had once marked peaceful farmland now concealed tanks, snipers, and the dead of both armies. The initial landings had been only the beginning. The real battle, the struggle to break out of Normandy, would last another 6 weeks. It was a slow, grinding campaign that exposed the full nature of modern war, not movement, but attrition. For the Allies, the key was logistics. Every bullet fired, every tank that rolled forward, was sustained by an invisible ocean of supply. Fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, a million details coordinated across the channel with mechanical precision. The Red Ball Express, a vast convoy system of trucks driven largely by African-American soldiers, began to deliver over 12,000 tons of supplies per day to the front lines. It was a moving artery of steel and rubber, stretching from Normandy's beaches to the heart of France. For the Germans, the same arithmetic spelled disaster. Their divisions fought bravely, but bled dry. Lacking fuel, they abandoned tanks intact. Lacking air cover, they fought blind. Lacking reserves, they fought until annihilation. By August 19, the Allies encircled the remnants of the German 7th Army at Falaise. The roads out of Chambois were clogged with thousands of destroyed vehicles, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and tens of thousands of dead. The retreat had become a rout. Rommel, wounded in an air attack on July 17, would never return to the front. His belief in a negotiated peace with the Western Allies sealed his fate. 3 months later, accused of complicity in the July 20 plot against Hitler, he was forced to take poison. His death marked the end of the old Prussian officer code and the beginning of a reckoning that Germany could not escape. Operation Overlord had cost the Allies 209,000 casualties, including 37,000 dead. German losses were even higher, over 400,000, with nearly 200,000 captured. But beyond the numbers, Normandy marked something deeper. The triumph of a new kind of warfare. It was not the brilliance of a single commander, nor the heroism of a single army, but the collective force of organization, production, and integration, the industrialization of strategy itself. In the words of British historian John Keegan, D-Day was not merely a battle for territory, but for time, the moment when the machine age finally conquered the battlefield. The beaches of Normandy, once soaked in blood and fear, became the foundation stones of a new Europe. From them flowed liberation, and with it, the long and painful birth of a different world, one in which power would no longer be measured by courage alone, but by the capacity to mobilize entire societies toward a single purpose. And as the guns fell silent and the ships returned to sea, the truth of D-Day became clear. It was not only a military victory, it was the industrial century's declaration of supremacy, the moment when history itself shifted from the age of heroes to the age of systems. When the tide rose over Normandy on June 6, 1944, it carried more than men and machines, it carried the future. In that clash of iron and will, the modern world revealed itself, a world where courage met production, and war became a matter of industry, organization, and endurance. D-Day was not the end of the Second World War, but it was the beginning of its conclusion, and the birth of an age shaped by the power of nations, not heroes.